The MongoDB configuration file is a way to organize the options you need to run the MongoD or MongoS process into an easy-to-parse YAML file. For the majority of use cases outside of the most basic of development or evaluation, you should be using a configuration file for storing your MongoD or MongoS startup options. Before we get into more detail on the configuration file, let's first start with what a MongoD option is. If you've interacted with the program in a terminal or shell environment, you are likely already familiar with how the command line options work. Typically, you have your main executable, for example, the MongoD. Then you chain in your command line options. Some of them take a value, like dbpath and logpath. Others work like a flag and don't require a value to direct behavior, like fork. In the end, you have your full command on the command line, with potentially dozens of options and values. This command is perfectly valid and would work fine in production environments, but there are problems with this approach. We would have to type this whole thing over again every time we would like to launch a new MongoD in a different server. If we want to track these settings, we would need to grep the existing services running in the server or run a command within MongoDB. Finally, it's harder to read and look for individual options along this very long command line string. Before we get into the configuration file, let's start with a few common command line options. You have your basic path configuration options, dbpath and logpath. Starting with 3.6, you need to set bind IP to include a network adapter on the host that provides access to the network. Otherwise, the MongoD can only accept connections on that same host. Setting the REPL set and key file options starts up the MongoD in replication mode with basic intra-cluster auth security and user authentication enabled. These are very common options, and chances are you'll see at least one of these in any MongoDB deployment. The SSL options are related to TLS SSL transport encryption. You don't need to know much about these options in detail for this course. Take a look at m103 here on MongoDB University for an in-depth course on cluster security, including TLS SSL. Alternatively, take a look at our documentation. Finally, we have fork, which just tells the MongoD to run as a daemon instead of being tied to a terminal window. So, what are the configuration file counterparts to these command line options? On the right, I have the full path to the configuration option. That means each key in the path to the final value is the parent of the YAML file. So the REPL set name configuration option falls under the replication parent key. Configuration files support deeper nesting as well. Take a look at these two options, SSL PEM key and SSL CA file. These are both under the SSL parent, which themselves are under the net parent. The net parent also captures bind IP. All three options are related to the net parent, but SSL PEM key and SSL CA key are specific to net.ssl. Now, how did I get to these mappings? This is where our fantastic manual comes to the rescue. All of our command line options and our configuration file options are well documented in these two links. I invite you to give these a look to find out about which command line options or configuration file options are available and how to map between the two. Now let's take our list of configuration file options with the full path to the option and translate that into our configuration YAML file. YAML stands for yet another markup language. You have your key value pairs. The top level key in a MongoDB configuration file represents a logical grouping of options. Each nested element under a top-level key represents an option related to that top-level key. So here we see that dbpath is a storage option. Remember previously this was listed as storage.dbpath. The command line option was --dbpath. A key can have multiple embedded key pair values, each representing an option related to the top-level key. So here we have our system log family of options, where I am specifying the path to the log file and the file type. You'll notice that our one option, log path, became two. Sometimes a configuration file option will have one or more required chained options. The documentation will always clearly state these relationships. It's also easier to see distinct groupings of related options. I can clearly distinguish the storage options from the system logging options from the replication options. I've even added a comment to improve readability and comprehension. The configuration file options have the same effect as the command line options, but as you can see, the YAML format provides significant advantages. These are all of the options from our initial example. The effect on the MongoD is the same, but the organization and readability is vastly improved. Now, how do we use a configuration file? Well, we are going to have to use at least one command line option for this to work. Specify --config or -f along with a path to the configuration file. For many Linux distributions, when installing MongoDB through a package manager, you'll find a default configuration file in etc/mongod.conf. Feel free to modify this or point to your own configuration file. You just need to ensure that the MongoD process can access the file location and read the file. You can find the complete list of configuration file options and how to use them on our online documentation. The documentation also includes structural examples as well as a description of how the options work and what the expected values are. To recap, configuration file options provide the same functionality as our command line options. They improve the readability of our configuration settings, and you can use the documentation to facilitate mapping a command line option to a configuration file option.